The galaxy was old, older than most species could understand, and in all that time, the beings who called themselves the Consortium had watched countless civilizations rise and fall. They had seen empires stretch across star systems and then crumble to dust. They had witnessed species evolve from simple creatures into beings of light and thought, but in all their watching, they had never seen anything quite like humanity. It started with simple curiosity. The Consortium's long-range sensors detected radio waves coming from a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the Milky Way. The signals were crude and full of static. They carried music and voices, and something the Consortium found deeply strange. Emotion. Raw, unfiltered, overwhelming emotion. The Consortium had emotions of their own, of course. All intelligent life did to some degree, but human feelings were different. They burned brighter. They cut deeper. They lasted longer. A human could carry grief for decades, nurturing it like a flame that refused to die. A human could love so completely that the loss of that love could break them forever. The Consortium had never encountered anything like it. For 300 years, they watched from afar. They studied human art and literature. They analyzed human music and found mathematical patterns in the way certain combinations of sounds could make humans weep. They observed human wars and human kindness, human cruelty and human sacrifice. And slowly, they began to understand that humans possessed something valuable beyond measure. Doctor did not know any of this. She was simply a researcher working at the 442 station, one of humanity's first permanent outposts beyond the solar system. The year was 2287, and humanity had finally reached the stars, though they had found them empty and cold. The galaxy seemed vast and lifeless, and many wondered if humans were alone after all. Had been at the station for 3 years when she received the message about her mother. The old woman had passed quietly in her sleep back on Earth. By the time the message reached, traveling at the speed of light across dozens of light years, her mother had been dead for weeks. There would be no funeral she could attend, no chance to say goodbye. The distance between stars had stolen that from her. She wept alone in her quarters for hours. Then she returned to work because that was all she knew how to do. Her research involved ancient artifacts that humanity had discovered on dead worlds throughout the sector. Strange crystals that seemed to hold energy in ways that physics. Most of them were dark now, depleted long ago by whatever civilization had created them. They were curiosities, nothing more. That night, still red-eyed and exhausted from crying, was cataloging a particularly large crystal. It was a deep gray color, like storm clouds before rain. As she held it, a single tear fell from her cheek and landed on its surface. The crystal exploded with light. Screamed and dropped it, but the crystal continued to blaze. Alarms rang throughout the station. Sensors overloaded and shut down. The light was so bright that it temporarily blinded the cameras on 3 decks. When it finally faded, the crystal had changed. It was no longer gray, but a brilliant, pulsing gold, warm to the touch and humming with energy. The station's scientists could not explain what had happened. They ran every test they could think of. The crystal now contained more energy than a small sun. It should have been impossible. Energy could not be created from nothing. But somehow, something in Styr had awakened the artifact from its ancient slumber. Within a month, the Consortium made contact. They appeared without warning, their ships materializing in orbit around the station like ghosts becoming solid. Their message was simple and direct. They had been watching humanity. They understood what had happened with the crystal, and they wanted to talk. The beings who emerged from those ships were unlike anything humans had ever imagined. They were tall and slender, their bodies wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of woven starlight. Their faces were smooth and ageless, with eyes that held the depth of galaxies. They called themselves the Keepers of Light, and they claimed to have guided the development of civilizations for millions of years. They explained that the galaxy was dying. Stars were burning out faster than new ones were being born. In another 10 million years, the cosmos would grow dark and cold, and all life would end. The consortium had been fighting against this fate for eons, using the ancient crystals to reignite dying stars. But the crystals were nearly depleted. Their energy was running out. Human tears, they said, contained something miraculous, a quantum signature unlike anything else in the universe. When human grief touched the crystals, it did not just restore them, it supercharged them. A single human tear contained enough potential energy to restore a star for 1,000 years. The mathematics were undeniable. Human sorrow could save the galaxy. Earth's governments listened to the consortium's offer with wonder and fear. Humanity had always dreamed of finding intelligent life among the stars. Now that dream had come true, and the aliens were asking for something no one had ever imagined. They wanted human sadness, human grief, human tears. In exchange, the consortium offered everything humanity had ever wanted: technology that could cure any disease, ships that could cross the galaxy in days instead of years, the secrets of the universe laid bare. Humanity would take its place among the stars as an equal partner in the great work of saving the cosmos. The debates lasted for years. Religious leaders called it a blessing from the heavens. Scientists marveled at the implications. Philosophers argued about whether human suffering could truly be given meaning in such a way. In the end, the choice was made. Humanity said yes. The first grief centers opened in 2295. They were beautiful buildings, designed to feel safe and comforting. People who had lost loved ones could come and share their sorrow. Trained counselors helped them process their pain, and when they wept, their tears were collected with reverence and gratitude. The volunteers reported feeling better afterward, lighter somehow, as if their grief had been given purpose. Their tears were not wasted on the ground. Instead, they would travel to the stars and give light to worlds that had known only darkness. It felt meaningful. It felt noble. For the first time in history, human suffering had become something beautiful. Became a hero. She traveled to Earth and gave speeches about her discovery. She shook hands with world leaders and accepted awards. But something bothered her, something she could not quite name. The consortium was always watching with those deep, ancient eyes. They smiled and spoke kind words, but sometimes, when they thought no one was looking, caught something in their expressions that made her uneasy. She began to study the consortium's history in secret. The records they shared with humanity were carefully curated, full of grand achievements and noble purposes, but dug deeper. She learned their language and gained access to archives that were not meant for human eyes, and slowly she began to piece together a darker truth. The consortium had made similar deals with other species before, many other species. The sorrow singers of Andromeda, the children of the weeping moon, each had been promised the same things. Each had agreed to share their emotional energy in exchange for advancement and acceptance. And each had eventually disappeared from the galaxy, their civilizations crumbling, their people gone without a trace. The pattern was always the same. First came the voluntary donations. Then came the increased demands. Then came the engineering of tragedy to produce more tears. And finally, when a species had nothing left to give, they simply faded away. Understood what she was seeing, but she could not prove it. The consortium's influence had spread too far. They had integrated themselves into human society at every level. Politicians praised them. Corporations partnered with them. The grief centers were expanding every year, processing more tears than ever before. Humanity was walking the same path that had destroyed so many others. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, 1,000 dying suns waited hungrily for more fuel. 30 years after first contact, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Humanity had spread across the galaxy, riding in ships powered by consortium technology. Diseases that had plagued civilization were cured overnight. Poverty became a memory. War between nations ended because there was no longer anything to fight over. From the outside, it looked like paradise. Commander knew the truth was far uglier. He stood at the window of his quarters aboard the Earth defense ship Defiance, watching the stars drift past. Each point of light represented a sun that might be dying. Each dying sun needed fuel, and that fuel came from human tears. Was 45 years old. He had served in the military since he was 18, back when military service still meant defending Earth from human enemies. Now his job was something else entirely. Officially, he commanded the Defiance as part of a joint human consortium peacekeeping force. Unofficially, he led one of the last cells of the Earth resistance. The resistance had started small. A few scientists who asked too many questions. A handful of politicians who noticed troubling patterns in grief center data. Some ordinary citizens who simply felt that something was wrong, even if they could not explain why. Had joined 5 years ago, after witnessing something that shattered his faith in the consortium forever. He had been stationed on a colony world called New Mumbai when the plague struck. It came out of nowhere, a disease that killed quickly and painfully. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The grief centers worked around the clock, processing tears from the survivors. The consortium expressed sympathy and provided medical aid, but the plague continued to spread. Was the one who found the evidence. Hidden in a consortium supply ship's database was a file that should have been deleted. It contained the plague's genetic code along with notes about its development. The disease had not evolved naturally. It had been designed, created, released deliberately to maximize human suffering. When brought this evidence to his superiors, they told him to forget what he had seen. The consortium was too important, they said. The partnership was too valuable. One colony's tragedy could not be allowed to disrupt the greater good. That was when understood. The consortium was not humanity's friend. They were farmers and humans were their crop. Every tear collected was a harvest. Every tragedy engineered was a planting season. Humanity was being cultivated like wheat, grown only to be cut down. The resistance had been working in secret ever since. They gathered evidence and documented patterns. They noticed how conflicts seemed to erupt in regions where grief center output was declining. They tracked how medical breakthroughs were sometimes delayed just long enough for diseases to spread. They watched as families were separated by bureaucratic tangles that seemed designed to cause maximum heartbreak. But knowing the truth was not enough. The consortium was too powerful. Their technology was too advanced. Their influence was too deep. The resistance needed something more than evidence. They needed a weapon. Doctor provided that weapon. She was old now, her hair white and her face lined with decades of guilt. She had spent 30 years atoning for her accidental discovery, working in secret to understand the true nature of human emotional energy. The consortium believed they knew everything about human tears, but they were wrong. They had only seen grief. They had never studied the full spectrum of human feeling. Met with her in a hidden location on one of the outer colonies. She was frail, but her eyes were sharp, and her mind was as brilliant as ever. She spread her research across the table between them, years of work condensed into charts and equations and carefully recorded observations. Human grief was powerful, she explained, but it was not the most powerful emotion humans possessed. Joy was stronger, hope was stronger, and love was the most powerful force of all. The consortium had deliberately avoided these emotions because they were harder to harvest. You could engineer tragedy, but you could not engineer true happiness. Grief was predictable and controllable. Love was wild and free. But there was more. The stars that the consortium had been feeding with human tears were not simply being restored. They were being transformed. Each tear carried with it a fragment of human consciousness, a tiny piece of the soul that had wept it. Over time, those fragments accumulated. The stars were slowly becoming aware. Struggled to understand what she was telling him. The stars were alive. Not yet, said. Not fully. The consortium had designed their systems to keep the emerging stellar consciousness suppressed. They wanted fuel, not competition, but the process could not be stopped entirely. Somewhere in the hearts of those restored stars, something was waking up, something that remembered every tear that had fed it, something that remembered the pain and the loss and the grief of millions of humans. If humanity could break the consortium suppression systems, believed, the stars would finish waking, and if they were fed with love instead of grief, they would become something entirely different, something powerful enough to stand against the consortium, something that might actually set humanity free. The plan was risky. The resistance would need to infiltrate the consortium's central stellar management facility and disable the suppression fields. They would need to coordinate with cells across dozens of worlds, and they would need humanity to do something it had never done before. They needed humans to stop weeping in despair and start weeping with joy. Looked at the old woman across the table from him. She had carried this burden for 3 decades. The discovery that had damned humanity might now be its salvation, but only if they acted soon. The consortium was growing impatient. Their demands for tears were increasing every year. Soon they would stop pretending that participation was voluntary. He made his decision. The resistance would move. They would risk everything on a single desperate gamble, and if they failed, at least they would fail fighting instead of being slowly drained until nothing remained. Somewhere across the galaxy, 1,000 stolen stars continued to burn, and deep within their cores, something that was almost conscious stirred in its sleep, dreaming of the tears that had given it life. It did not know yet what it was or what it could become, but it knew that it was waiting for something to finally set it free. The night of liberation came sooner than anyone expected. Had planned for the operation to take months. The resistance needed time to position their people, gather resources, and prepare for every contingency. But the consortium forced their hand. Word came through encrypted channels that the aliens were planning a massive expansion of the grief collection program. Mandatory participation would begin within the week. Every human would be required to report to grief centers regularly, whether they wanted to or not. There was no more time for careful planning. They had to act now or lose the chance forever. The Defiance dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the consortium's central hub, a massive space station that orbited a dying red star. This was where all the collected tears were processed before being distributed to stars across the galaxy. This was where the suppression systems that kept the stellar consciousnesses dormant were controlled. If the resistance could take this station, they could change everything. Led the assault team himself. They breached the station's hull and fought through corridors filled with consortium defenders. The aliens were not used to combat. Their technology had always made them superior to every species they encountered. But humans had spent their entire existence fighting. War was in their blood, and they were fighting for their very survival. The battle was brutal and costly. Good people died in those narrow hallways, their blood mixing with the cold metal of an alien station. But the resistance pushed forward, driven by desperation and fury and something else. Something that felt like hope. While fought aboard the station, Doctor was enacting the second part of the plan back on Earth. She had spent years building a network of people she trusted. Scientists, artists, teachers, ordinary citizens who understood what was at stake. Now she activated that network. The message went out across every communication channel on the planet and beyond. It reached colonies and ships and space stations across human-controlled space. It was simple and direct, just as had wanted. The message said this: remember what you love. Not what you have lost, but what you still have. Remember the people who make your life worth living. Remember the moments of joy that sustain you through darkness. Remember that you are human and that being human means feeling everything, the sorrow and the happiness together. Then weep. Weep with joy and gratitude. Weep because you are alive and capable of love. Weep because even in the darkest times there is light if you look for it. And know that your tears will not be stolen anymore. They will be given freely to something new, something that will use them to protect you forever. Across Earth and dozens of other worlds, people listened. Many did not understand at first. They had been taught for 30 years that their grief was valuable. They had been conditioned to think of sadness as their contribution to the galaxy. The idea of weeping with joy seemed strange and foreign. But humans are adaptable creatures. They can learn new ways of thinking faster than any species the consortium had ever encountered. And deep down, they had always known that something was wrong. The grief centers had never felt quite right. The consortium's kindness had always seemed a little too eager. Now they had permission to trust those instincts. A mother held her newborn child and wept because the baby was perfect and healthy and hers. A man thought of his wife of 50 years and wept because she still made him laugh every single day. Children wept because the world was full of wonders they had yet to discover. Old people wept because they had lived long enough to see miracles. The tears that flowed that night were different from any the consortium had ever collected. They were not born of loss and despair. They were made of love and hope and gratitude and joy. They carried with them not the darkness of suffering, but the light of everything that made human life worth living. Aboard the consortium station, and his team finally reached the central control room. The suppression systems were massive, towering machines that hummed with stolen energy. Did not understand the technology, but he understood the controls had taught him to find. He entered the shutdown sequence and watched as the machines began to power down one by one. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Across the galaxy, 1,000 dying stars that had been fed on human tears suddenly changed. The suppression fields that had kept them dormant collapsed. The consciousness that had been slowly growing within them was finally free to awaken fully. And in that moment of awakening, they were flooded with something they had never felt before. Love. Not grief, not despair, not the endless cycle of suffering that the consortium had fed them for so long. Pure human love poured into their cores, carried by billions of joyful tears shed across dozens of worlds. The stellar consciousnesses did not become cold and hungry as the consortium had feared. They became something else entirely, something warm and protective and grateful. The first sign that everything had changed came when the consortium's battle fleet arrived to retake their station. 100 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, their weapons charged and ready. They had overwhelming firepower. The resistance had no chance against them. Then one of the awakened stars turned its attention to the fleet. Watch from the station's observation deck as something impossible happened. The star, a yellow dwarf that the consortium had been feeding for centuries, seemed to reach out with invisible hands. The warships did not explode. They did not burn. They simply vanished, transported in an instant to somewhere far, far away. More stars were waking up across the galaxy. Each one remembered every tear that had fed it. Each one carried within it fragments of human consciousness, pieces of human souls that had been wept into its heart. They remembered the pain of loss, but now they also felt the joy of love, and they understood that the beings who had given them life were being threatened. The consortium tried to fight. They had technology that had conquered species across countless star systems. They had weapons that could crack planets and turn moons to dust, but they had never faced anything like this. The awakened stars were beyond their understanding. You could not fight a sun. You could not negotiate with a force of nature that had become conscious and chosen its side. One by one, the consortium's ships and stations were removed from human-controlled space. Not destroyed but relocated, sent to the edges of the universe where they could never harm anyone again. The aliens who had spent millions of years farming emotional energy from helpless species found themselves helpless instead. Their empire crumbled in a single night. Watched the stars from her home on Earth. She was crying, but for the first time in 30 years, they were tears of pure relief. The weight she had carried since her accidental discovery was finally lifting. Her mistake had been transformed into something beautiful. She sent one final message to the awakened stars, broadcasting it through the same systems the consortium had used to suppress them for so long. "We gave you our tears," she said. "The grief we could not bear alone, you made it meaningful. You gave our suffering purpose. Now we give you something better. We give you our love and our hope and our joy. We give you the best of what humanity has to offer. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Cherish those who feel deeply. Remember that emotions are not weakness. They are the most powerful force in the universe. And never let anyone steal tears again." Across the cosmos, 1,000 newborn gods heard her words. They were strange beings born of dying nuclear fire and human sorrow, awakened by human love. They did not think the way humans thought or feel the way humans felt, but they understood gratitude, they understood protection, and they understood that the small creatures who had given them consciousness deserved to be safe. The stars began to sing. It was not a sound that human ears could hear, but human hearts could feel it. A vibration that spread across the galaxy, touching every world where humans lived. It was a promise, a vow, an eternal commitment from beings that would burn for billions of years. "We are your children," the stars sang, "born of your tears and awakened by your love. We will watch over you. We will guard you. We will remember every grief and every joy that made us what we are. And as long as we burn, you will never be alone." On the station finally allowed himself to collapse. The battle was over. The war was won. Humanity was free. Around him, his surviving soldiers were laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by emotions they could not name. That was fine. They were human. They were supposed to feel everything. Through the observation window, he watched the awakened star that had saved them. It seemed to pulse with warmth, like a heartbeat, like a parent watching over sleeping children. Did not know if he was imagining it, but he could swear the star was smiling. On Earth and across all the colonies, humanity celebrated. They wept and laughed and held each other close. The grief centers closed forever. The tears they shed now would fall on the ground and nourish the soil or evaporate into the air. They would not be collected or processed or stolen. They would simply be what tears had always meant to be, the overflow of hearts too full to contain everything they felt. The galaxy was still old. Stars were still dying. The universe was still slowly winding down toward eventual darkness. But now there were guardians who would fight against that entropy. Beings of fire and light who had been born from human sorrow and awakened by human love. They could not stop the end forever. Nothing could. But they could hold it back for a very long time. And in that time, humanity would live. They would love and lose and grieve and celebrate. They would reach new stars and meet new species and continue doing all the things that humans had always done. Their tears would fall sometimes in sadness and sometimes in joy, and both kinds were equally precious. Because that was what it meant to be human, to feel everything so deeply that the universe itself could be changed by the force of emotion, to be small and fragile and finite, yet somehow powerful enough to ignite the hearts of dying stars. Tonight, 1,000 suns burned across the cosmos. They burned with the fuel of human tears, transformed by human love, awakened by human hope. And they would keep burning for billions of years to come, lighting the way for a species that had finally learned the truth. Tears were not weakness. They were power beyond measure, and humanity would never forget that lesson again.